Madam Ambassador, thank you for joining us, and delighted to have you here.
Thank you for having me. This has got to be the coolest set I have ever seen.
I'm going to quote you on that.
You've got a great setup here. I'm so
Thank
jealous. It's awesome.
Well, we're happy to have the set. We're even more happy to have guests like you, and your book is explosive. I mean, it has been quoted on every media outlet. I want to first get to the title, with all due respect. There was a line that you said, I thought it was one of the classiest Nikki Haley lines ever. Larry Kudlow had said something that maybe you were a little confused, and you said, with all due respect, I don't get confused.
That's exactly right.
What's the background?
You know, there's a time and place where you have to stand up for yourself because no one else will. And the president had, with the National Security Council, had decided to put sanctions on Russia. And I talked to the president again the next day. We were going forward, and I only did the Sunday shows when the White House asked me to. And so I went on Face the Nation, and I said, you will see Stephen Mnuchin come down with sanctions if he hasn't already. Go back, Stephen calls me that night, who's a dear friend, calls me that night and says, Nikki, we've got a problem. The president changed his mind. Oh. And the president has every right to change his mind. You know, he is the president.
And he does do that occasionally.
He does, and there's no issues with that. And I said, that's fine, just fix it. The next morning they come out with a statement, doesn't really fix it. The press is on this going, why'd she say it, why'd she say it, and they're not letting go. I called the Secretary of State, I called the National Security Advisor, I called the Chief of Staff. I said, look, you need to fix this. Just tell the truth. Just tell the truth that he changed his mind, and nothing happened. So the next day comes around and I said, okay, you've got until 5 o'clock. You fix this or I'm gonna fix this.
I mean, they've hung you on a limb in a way, right?
Absolutely, and it's better if y'all fix it than me. And here comes Larry out there, and he said in front of the press corps, I think Nikki was momentarily confused. And that was it. I was looking at the television show and I saw Dana Perino, my friend, and I texted her and I said, can you call me? And she called me and I said, just one sentence. Will you say on the record that I said, with all due respect, I don't get confused? Larry called immediately, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. I have my tail between my legs. You know, I'll make it up to you. And I said, you will? And I said, I need you to go out and set the record straight. And he said, I can't do that. And I said, you have to. You have to. And within 10 minutes, he set the record straight, and it was all fine. But
Larry's a great guy, and he's a stand-up guy, and he proved it But I'll tell you what, that showed everybody. Don't mess with Nikki Haley. She's not going to just fall back over and say, okay, whatever you guys want to do. And I think that's why you had such an effective tenure at the UN. That's not exactly a friendly environment for an American ambassador.
It's like putting on body armor every day. You know you're going to have a fight. You just don't know which country you're fighting that day. It's brutal. But at the same time, I was so blessed to defend the country that we both love so much. And so it was a pleasure. I had a great time doing it. I really did. Your
articulation of America's position with Israel, particularly with this president, who has been more supportive than any president ever. No one equals him. But your articulation of the American position and the reason that we have such strong ties with Israel, legendary stuff. Ambassador, it was just some of the strongest stuff I've ever heard anyone, and I mean anyone, say at the United Nations to the faces of the diplomatic community. What was the steely resolve within you?
It was important to acknowledge a truth. And you know, what you saw were a lot of countries bashing Israel because they could. And no one had stood up for Israel. And Israel is a bright spot in a really tough neighborhood.
Yes, it is.
They share our values. They're a democracy. If they are strong, then the world is a better place. And so it was really important that everyone know that we were going to have Israel's back. And you know, during the Obama administration, America let Israel down in the worst way. We basically allowed a resolution to go through that condemned Israel and humiliated them at a time where they needed us to have their back. And I told the ambassador to Israel, I said, that will never happen again on my watch. And I think that the courage of the president to do what so many presidents wanted to do, but everyone told him you can't do it because the sky would fall. The courage that he had to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and do it with such strength, I was so proud to be a part of that. I really was.
It was so powerful. I was there in Jerusalem when the moment came,
Oh, wow.
and it was moved.
Wow.
And I've been going there since 1973. So for me, this was deeply personal. I don't think anybody was sitting out there with a dry eye. It was surreal. This is a president who has demonstrated a commitment to principles that he campaigned on.
Yes.
And a lot of people thought, well, like every other politician, he will say these things, and he gets into office, he'll find an excuse to not do it. That is a great example. You were obviously a part of the process of his making that decision. Take us inside. What was the tipping point for him on the embassy move?
Well, I think that first of all, Congress had voted for this over and over again. So it was the will of the American people to see this embassy put in the capital of Israel, which is Jerusalem. And so when we had the national security meetings, frankly, a lot of his members didn't want the move out of the fact that they were worried that people would die, that protests would happen, that, you know, everything would break out in riots. And the president just said, if we don't do this, who will?
Yeah.
And it really was a very courageous moment. I supported him because I think that what I saw at the United Nations was they were pacifying the Palestinians by not being truthful. And once we did this, it would let the Palestinians know, you've got to come to the negotiating table because this is a fact. And every other American embassy is in the capital.
Yeah.
Why would we do anything different for Israel? And so he stood strong against his own national security team, who many of them didn't want him to do it. And he said, we're going to do this. And not only is Israel stronger, the United Nations took notice. And I think we acknowledged the truth that let the Palestinians know, look, we're not going to deal in falsities anymore. We're going to make sure that we acknowledge some facts on the ground.
Ambassador, you never placated the Palestinian position nor pretended that there was going to be some magical moment at which everybody would toast marshmallows around the campfire. And I think it was one of the reasons that so many of us so valued your being there. But I have to wonder, how many social engagements did you not get invited to in New York because you had taken such a strong stand for the United States and against some of these really bully countries?
I didn't care.
Yeah.
I didn't care. You know, life is easier when you tell the truth.
Yeah.
And for me, it was doing what I thought was right. It was doing what the president wanted. And it was a pleasure to do it. You know, that was the first American veto that I used was when they tried to condemn us on that move from the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And that was our sovereign right to do it. And we had been so generous to the Palestinians. We'd given over $6 billion over 10 years, more than all the other Arab countries combined, we had given to the Palestinians. And so you can placate something that's false in the name of being sweet and nice to a group, or you can acknowledge a truth and make both sides come together and work on it based on facts. And this was a fact.
I think too, and you pointed this out in your book and in other things you've said, the Palestinians would take the money that we gave them, that $6 billion, and they didn't use it for peaceful purposes.
No.
They didn't build schools and infrastructure, water systems and curbs and gutters and parks. They used it to fund terrorism. I mean, that's offensive to me as an American taxpayer, that I'm funding an assault against the only democracy basically between the Atlantic and the Pacific throughout all of the Southern Hemisphere.
Well, and I talk about in the book how basically I wanted us to pull back the money we were giving to the Palestinian agency because they weren't reforming. In their textbooks, they would actually have things against Israel that they were teaching Palestinian kids. And when we tried to get them to change it, they wouldn't. And so I went to the president and I said, why are we giving money to an agency that's anti-American? And they literally would protest us in the streets because we weren't giving money. But it was more than that. Why would we give all of this money that kept this agency afloat when their Arab brothers and sisters weren't even giving as much money as we were? They had more of a responsibility than we did. And so that was another right that needed to happen to replace a lot of years of wrongdoing.
I think the book is worth every penny of it just for the story that you tell about this extraordinary tension that you had with Secretary of State at the time, Rex Tillerson, Chief of Staff John Kelly. I love John Kelly. Was not as big a fan of Tillerson, but love John Kelly for his service. But you really had to stand up to these guys. They were trying to, I guess, throw you under the proverbial bus.
Well, I think, look, I think both of these men are patriots. I think they were trying to serve their country. They were just wrong. Because the part of, basically they came and pulled me aside after we had had this argument on the funding of the Palestinians, pulled me aside, and after an hour of going back and forth on this, they said, look, we need you to work with us. We are trying to save the country. The president doesn't know what he's doing, and if we don't do these things, people will die. Now, it would be different if they thought the president was unfit. It would be different if they thought he was just rogue. This was on policy disagreements. They didn't think that he should get out of the Iran deal. They didn't think that he should get out of the Paris Climate Agreement. They didn't think he should move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So if you have policy agreements, they had every opportunity in the National Security Council to discuss those and debate them. And the president was very good at listening. If they didn't like what he was doing, they needed to quit, not recruit other people to be with him. And the reason this bothered me so much, and you can appreciate, is because we were governors.
Yes.
And it's hard to get elected. And when you win, you feel a responsibility to the people that elected you. He had a job to do. He was trying to do that. To have your own cabinet members defy what you're trying to do and stall things and stop them, it's just wrong.
A painful time.
Yeah.
The murders in Charleston at Mother Emanuel Church shocked the nation, stunned everyone.
Yeah.
And I think the only thing more stunning to the murders themselves by this horrible young racist was the amazing reaction on the part of so many of the victims and their families. That impacted you more deeply than I ever realized until you talked about it in your book, and you talked about it with such depth. Tell me why that's such an important moment in your life that transformed the future for you.
It was just so painful. For the entire state, it was painful. I mean, here you had 12 people who did what so many South Carolinians do on a Wednesday night. They went to Bible study.
Yeah.
But on that night, someone else showed up. He didn't look like them, he didn't act like them, he didn't sound like them. They didn't throw him out. They didn't call the cops. Instead, they pulled up a chair and prayed with him for an hour. And when they went in that last moment of prayer, he began to shoot. These were people like Ethel Lance, who had lost her daughter 2 years prior to breast cancer. And she had a broken heart, but she would go around Mother Emanuel cleaning the church, singing, "One day at a time, sweet Jesus, that's all I ask of you. Give me the strength to do every day what I have to do." Our youngest victim, Tywanza Sanders, had just finished college. And on that night, he stood in front of his great Aunt Susie, 87 years old, and he looked at the killer and he said, "You don't have to do this. We mean no harm to you." Or it was people like Cynthia Hurd, whose life motto was simply to be kinder than necessary. That's who these people were. They weren't famous, but they loved their church, they loved their families, they loved their community. And it was the first time we had had a shooting in a place of worship. And I remember having to tell my kids and wondering how they would feel safe in a church again. And then 2 days later, the families go to the courthouse. There's the killer in front of the judge, and one by one, unprompted, unplanned, they look at the killer and they forgave him. It was the most powerful sense of faith and love that people can't understand.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to hold my arms around South Carolina. The national media wanted to come in and define the moment. They wanted it to be about racism, they wanted it to be about gun control, they wanted it to be about death penalty. And I strong-armed them and said, there will be a time and place where we have these discussions. That is not now. We're going to go through these funerals. I went to all the funerals. They were all open casket. The families were devastated over the bodies, and it was a lot. But the people of South Carolina stood up. We didn't have protests, we had vigils. We didn't have violence, we had hugs. And the people of South Carolina showed the world what grace and strength looks like in times of tragedy.
Do you feel like that was, in many ways, a defining moment for you as a human being, not just as a public servant and a public figure who obviously was front and center for all of it, but in the behind the scenes, just dealing with the grief of that?
I struggled so much in a way I couldn't understand, because I knew too much of what happened in that room from the investigators. I'd been to every funeral, and I think the overwhelming emotion and sadness of it just got to me. And it got to the point where I would go out and do a press conference and I'd come back into the office and cry. Or I would go home and I would just crawl into bed and just cry for hours. And one day, my chief of staff and her husband, who's my doctor, were there. And he said, "You're showing signs of PTSD. And I felt so guilty, because I wasn't the one that was affected by that. I didn't go through near what the survivors went through or the families went through, and my husband also knew something was wrong. And so I started going through therapy.
Yeah.
I threw myself into my job. So when we had a hurricane, or we had, a school shooting, or we had a 1,000-year flood, I so desperately wanted to protect the people of South Carolina. So I worked harder. But I look back now, 4 years later, and it was my faith that was strengthened, because I was at my most desperate moment, and only God could help me through that, because nothing else worked. And it was building a stronger faith, but it was also understanding how precious lives are and time is, and how we have to be grateful for every moment.
Like it was for those victims of the shooting in Charleston, and what you've just described, it was not a natural reaction.
No.
It was a supernatural reaction.
Yes.
And the candor with which you share it is so very powerful. That's why I hope people will read your book.
Thank you.
It's an encouragement. It's also an enlightenment. And if people are political, they'll love it. If people are believers, they're going to love it.
Yeah.
They'll find out that some of the rough and tumble of Washington is not always pretty, but they need to know that. One final question before I let you get away.
Yes.
Everybody wants to know about Nikki Haley's future, what it's going to be.
Me too.
I don't expect you to reveal anything. You've been asked that question too many times. But is there a political possibility, I'll leave it like that, in the future of Nikki Haley?
I don't know. And you and I both know a year is a lifetime in politics.
Yeah.
And so what I do know is that as I look at this year, I'm working on the book. I started a policy group called Stand for America that really engages younger people so that they can, because they don't look at TV and newspaper, they go online. And this creates an idea for a policy platform for them to know capitalism versus socialism, to know why there's an anti-Israel bias at the UN, to know what Medicare for All means. It gives a lot of different areas. And then I'm campaigning for people that I think should be elected. I did an event for the president not too long ago. I was in Colorado for Cory Gardner and Iowa for Joni Ernst. And so I'm getting my political fix that way. So I'm going to take it one election at a time. I mean, no one knew that Barack Obama would win.
Yeah.
No one knew that Donald Trump would win. And I think it would be wasted energy to think past this election. And so I'll just take it one election at a time.
Well, we hope that you're going to be in one of those somewhere out there. The book is With All Due Respect, Nikki Haley's exciting, extraordinary book that I hope you will get a copy of. Available now in book form, Kindle form, audio book. You can find her book and tour schedule at NikkiHaleyBook.com. Follow her on Twitter at Nikki Haley.